Next is Patricia Coyne-Fague. Welcome, Director.
Thank you so much, Madam Vice Chair and Vice Chair Knight. My name is Trish Coyne-Fague. I'm the Director of the Rhode Island Department of Corrections, and I realize that there are probably a number of you that don't know me. So I'd like to just spend just a small portion of my time giving you a little bit of background about myself, if that's okay. We have provided the committee with a comprehensive letter that outlines all of our reasons for opposing this legislation. And so my goal tonight is to provide you with an overview, and then there are a couple of other witnesses with specialized technical knowledge that are going to testify in their area of expertise at the Department of Corrections, which I think you will find enlightening. Over the course of this evening's testimony, you may gain an impression of me as either someone who not only condones but actively advocates abuse, or a clueless bureaucrat who has no idea what her staff is doing. And I assure you that I am neither. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a lifelong Rhode Islander. I graduated from St. Mary's Academy, Bayview in East Providence. At Bayview, the emphasis is on strong women. This philosophy, coupled with my upbringing, which emphasized hard work and compassion for others, allowed me the confidence to seek a career in public service where I could use my education and skills in a way that could give back to my community. And I was taught, of those to whom much is given, much is required. I am proud to say I'm a graduate of Rhode Island College, earning a Bachelor of Arts degree with honors. I graduated from the New England School of Law, and after passing the bar, I went to work as a criminal prosecutor in the Office of the Attorney General. I worked in district court and family court before being promoted to superior court in the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit Patient Abuse Unit. There I did extremely rewarding and often heartbreaking work, prosecuting individuals charged with abuse, neglect, or mistreatment of nursing home residents, hospital patients, and those suffering from developmental disabilities. The victims in those cases often had no one to speak for them, and I was their advocate. This January, I began my 23rd year at the Department of Corrections, and it is where I have spent the bulk of my career in public service. In January 2000, I was hired by then Acting Director A.T. Wall as a staff attorney, coordinating the DOC's legislative initiatives and response, as well as representing the department in civil litigation in state and federal court on all kinds of topics, including constitutional issues. I assisted with policy development, litigated in mental health court, argued appeals before the state Supreme Court and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. I litigated contract and discipline cases through the labor and arbitration process and many other duties. I have spent 23 years in and out of the ACI facilities on a regular basis at all hours of the day and night. In 2004, I was promoted to Chief Legal Counsel, and in 2012, Director Wall asked me to serve as Assistant Director for Administration, a position I held until his retirement in 2018. In 2019, I was appointed by Governor Raimondo and unanimously confirmed by the Senate as Rhode Island's first female Director of Corrections. The authority and tremendous responsibilities of the Director of Corrections are spelled out in Rhode Island General Laws 4256-10. Every aspect of staff and offender management is delineated in that statute. The legislation before you would significantly impair the Director's ability to fulfill my obligations under that statute, while nevertheless assigning me responsibility for them. I take those responsibilities very seriously. I am guided every day by the knowledge that every offender under our supervision is somebody's child, sibling, spouse, parent, or loved one. Regardless of the crimes they've committed, they are human beings, and we treat them as such. We do not torture people. The ACI bears little resemblance to what you see in television programs or movies, and frankly, some of what might be described here tonight. Every time I take someone on a tour of our facilities, the first comment they make is that it wasn't what they thought it would be. It's so clean. It's so quiet. It feels safe. The ACI has come a long way from the days of federal court oversight in terms of care, custody, and control. I have toured the ACI with members of this General Assembly, 3 governors, other elected officials, cabinet members, judges, and professionals and national experts. All have been impressed by the professionalism of the staff and the cleanliness and order of the facilities. Judges determine who is sent to us and for how long. We cannot refuse anyone and we have no part to play in whether or for how long anyone is incarcerated. For most inmates in our custody, the trauma, economic, and social factors that may have led to their incarceration occurred long before they crossed the threshold into our custody. Realizing there are societal and personal circumstances that are beyond our control, we do everything we can to help those in our charge and prepare them for release while meeting our mission of public safety. Unfortunately, not everyone who comes to us finds it easy to conform in general population to the rules of the ACI. The rules are meant to keep everyone safe: staff, other inmates, and members of the public who rely on us. By removing the deterrent value of disciplinary confinement, as this legislation would do, inmates will have little incentive to follow the rules. People will get hurt, or worse, including other inmates who rely on us to keep them safe. Without a system to provide order to those that would break our rules, inmates will be forced to take matters into their own hands and protect themselves. The resulting anarchy will transport the ACI back into the 1970s, when lawlessness reigned inside the ACI. Assaults and escape were commonplace and ultimately resulted in costly litigation and federal court control. References to solitary confinement, SEG, or the hole are meant to evoke visions of the ACI as prisons are depicted in the movies. But the dark, dirt floor box Andy Dufresne was held in on the whim of a corrupt warden in The Shawshank Redemption bears no resemblance to the process afforded to ACI inmates who break the rules, nor the conditions the inmate lives in, even while being sanctioned for those violations. I've asked two individuals, Warden Lynn Corey and our Director of Clinical Behavioral Health, Caitlin Bouchard, to tell you in some detail about the reality of life at the ACI: restrictive housing, provision of due process, care of those struggling with mental illness, and sound correctional practice. They are two of the corrections experts I am proud to call my colleagues, recognizing that we are in the midst of federal court litigation on these issues. We may be limited in what we can discuss in detail. But I am sure the committee will find their expertise informative. I once again encourage any legislator who questions whether what we are saying is true to come and see for themselves. The level of transparency I am offering and willingness to invite you to tour our facilities should speak volumes about the level of confidence I have in the way the DOC is run, for which I am ultimately responsible. Finally, the testimony you will hear tonight is sure to be emotional. And while it is not my intention to discount or diminish anyone's personal experiences, it must be stated that the experience of having been incarcerated does not convert one into a corrections expert. Similarly, testimony related to terms of incarceration or employment at the ACI, which occurred 5, 10, 20, or more years ago, is not a fair description of the department as it exists and is run today. The DOC has evolved and continues to evolve. We have listened and continue to do so. But I cannot support legislation that I and other corrections experts see as posing an unacceptable risk to the safety and security of inmates, staff, and the public. And I respectfully ask that this committee does not either. I'd like to make 3 short points based on some prior testimony. First of all, out-of-cell time. We have increased out-of-cell time. Would I like to increase out-of-cell time more? Absolutely. I don't have the staff. Plain and simple. We have a large contingent of staff, corrections staff, who are eligible to retire in the next 3 years. And so this is a staffing situation that is frankly only going to get worse. Recruitment is a challenge. If you've seen any of the finance hearings, you know Colonel Manny, myself, anyone in law enforcement struggles to recruit right now. We have a very small class sitting right now. It's not going to make a dent. And so it's not an unwillingness to increase out-of-cell time. It's simply I don't have the staff to accommodate that. After the 2017 Commission on Restrictive Housing, we developed and implemented a unit at the High Security Center called the Residential Treatment Unit. And it is a very small unit at high security, and I invite you to come see it for yourself, where inmates, particularly with mental illness, who struggle to survive, frankly, in general population due to that mental illness, are treated in a very intensive program that has been quite successful. We have an occupational therapist who works with them, and I know Ms. Bouchard will describe the program in a little more detail. We did that with $0 allocated because it was the right thing to do. I recently brought a senator through that unit, and she noticed that there was a yard outside the door. Now, inmates in high security recreate in a courtyard that is cement, and she asked, why can't they touch grass? And so I asked, why can't they touch grass? Well, they couldn't touch grass because the area that we would use it for hadn't been used in a long time. Grass was about that high. And there are some improvements that need to be made to the security of that area in order to allow high security inmates to recreate outside. And we are making those improvements because it's the right thing to do. And then finally, in terms of programming for inmates in this situation, the Department of Corrections in the governor's budget is seeking the use of ARPA funds to implement a Wi-Fi system, which will allow increased programming for inmates with mental illness, for inmates in restrictive housing, for inmates who, for whatever reason, cannot handle the rigors of a classroom, so that they can have programming available to them in that way, because we know it's important, because we know with rare exception, everyone's getting out someday, and we take that obligation incredibly seriously. I'm very happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you, Director. And any questions? Chairman Corvese.
Thank you, Director. This is the first time I've heard you speak, and you've articulated your position well. I'm sure we're going to hear additional testimony, both pro and con, articulated very well this evening. Contrary to what some people may think about the individuals who occupy this place, we try to be fair. And trying to keep an open mind on this, I believe Representative Felix had mentioned a number of other states that had instituted, if not the exact or similar legislation that is before us. Simply put, what makes Rhode Island different than those other states?
Certainly. So there's a very small number of states nationwide that are unified systems. Rhode Island is one of them. What that means is we are a combination of jail and prison. Most other states have county jails. Then they also have prison. Prison is where you're sentenced. Jail is where you generally serve a short sentence or a wait trial. So we're different in that way. We're a very small system. Rhode Island is a very small state. There's only 1 degree of separation in between any two people in Rhode Island. And that makes management of an offender population particularly challenging in a way that maybe isn't in Montana, for example. I can tell you that some states have implemented some of these changes as a result of lawsuits, and I've read some of these lawsuit settlements and have noted that a lot of the things that other states have agreed to in settlement of those lawsuits are things that we're already doing. Where we're concerned is when the scale tips too far to take away our ability to keep everyone safe. I know Warden Corey is going to discuss this, but as an example, there is a facility that, frankly, the state no longer owns. It's called the Donald Price Medium Security Facility. You can see it off the highway. And it was a medium security prison named after Donald Price, who was a 22 or 23-year-old correctional officer who was murdered by an inmate. And so they named a prison facility after him. The inmate that murdered Donald Price stabbed an officer at maximum security in 2019. I remember it was because it was CO week, and I went over right after he was stabbed. The inmate, when he stabbed this officer and told us that it was his intention to take another one out before he died, was over 70 years old. Under this legislation, he would do 15 days. This is an inmate already serving a life sentence. 15 days is not enough of a deterrent. An inmate who is 21 years old, who wants to murder a rival gang member or sexually assault someone, 15 days is not a deterrent. It's all we have. If you allow an inmate to take all of his or her possessions with him or her into disciplinary confinement without losing any of their privileges, that's not a deterrent. It's like sending your kid to his room when he has a state-of-the-art video game console in there, you know? We have very few tools for the management. Many other prison systems have multiple facilities of each classification. So if they have a problem in maximum, they have another maximum that they can spread their inmates out into. I have one. I have 1 high security, 1 maximum, 1 medium, 1 minimum, 1 women's, and 1 jail. And so within those confines, I think Rhode Island is very different. And so what might work for Montana, I submit, isn't the same here. And when I have people with decades of corrections experience telling me this could be very, very bad and very, very dangerous, and when I refer to the obligations that this assembly requires of me in 425610, I can't support it.
Thank you for your testimony. Let me just make one quick comment. You had referenced the 1970s and the condition of the ACI. The 1970s as compared to today, there is a difference in the ACI, and there is a difference in those individuals who are committing crimes. Things are a little different in the 70s than they were now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Felix?
Thank you, Rep. McEntee, and thank you, Director, for coming out and testifying regarding this bill. So in your testimony, you talked about being able to use restrictive housing for inmates who may be problematic, and as a way to confine them and as a way of punishing them, or I forgot what word exactly you used. Do you have data in terms of how solitary confinement or restrictive housing, how's anyone want to call it, has helped in terms of achieving those two goals?
Sure. I mean, first of all, it's not just that we are having trouble managing someone. We have a very comprehensive disciplinary policy, which is written as informed by Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court case law. Our disciplinary process for inmates in our custody provides more due process than the United States Supreme Court requires. And there are many layers of that disciplinary process. So it's not just one officer who has a beef with an inmate saying, that's it, you're in the hole, bye. It doesn't work that way. There's an entire process, there's an appeal process, there's a review process after the person is sanctioned to disciplinary confinement, where their disciplinary time can be suspended. And I know Warden Corey is going to talk to you about at least one of those cases. If someone's discipline is motivated or caused in some way by the struggles they are having with mental illness, our policy addresses that as well. Our policy addresses that as well. Every day, our mental health staff, per policy, review the list of inmates who have been placed in disciplinary confinement the day before. And they review that list to see if there's anyone that they know to be already under treatment. And then they can intervene, and that discipline time can be suspended. Because obviously, if someone is acting out as a result of their mental illness, that disciplinary confinement is not going to have an impact on them or their future behavior, which is the point of disciplinary confinement. Since the revisions as a result of the commission in 2017, the list of offenses, if you will, that can expose an inmate to up to a year in disciplinary confinement has been greatly reduced. It used to be, I mean, to be fair, I started working there 23 years ago. You could get a year in SAG, 30 days at a time and it would exceed your prison term. I watched men leave high security segregation to the street because they were done with their sentence. That's not a good way to manage an offender who's going back to his community. We know that. We don't do that. So only the most serious offenses expose an offender to what we call long-term disciplinary confinement. We find that, future good behavior while in disciplinary confinement can definitely, they're incentivized to do that because that time can be suspended and they're released from that disciplinary confinement. But in order to have a deterrent effect on especially those most violent offenses, usually against another inmate, it's an important management tool.
Sure.
Thank you. But do you guys then, I guess I understand in terms of the policies, and I read some of your policies in terms of different forms of trying to help inmates, but I guess going back to my question is I understand that there's other non-punitive forms, but is there data from Rhode Island DOC that shows that by implementing solitary confinement or restrictive housing, how, anyone wants to call it, actually changes an inmate's behavior for the better?
What I can show you is that historical data that once we had a disciplinary policy, once we left sort of the Wild West of the 1970s, and had a disciplinary policy that provided real process to inmates and real ability for them to correct their behavior and be rewarded, if you will, for that by having that time suspended, the level of violence in our facilities declined. And so the number of incidents, and that's what we call, whenever anything bad happens, an incident, the number of incidents has declined. And so over time, yeah, I can get you the data, but if you looked at a graph, you're going to see the level of violence in our prisons markedly declining from a time when there weren't these methods in place to now. And that's why we are one of the safest prison systems in the country. Not because we keep people all locked up in cells all the time and they never get out and cause trouble, but because there's a very clear process. There are numerous avenues of grievance for inmates who feel they've been mistreated or that we didn't follow our own policy. And so, I think that it's a much more professional, cognizant type of system than it used to be. And I think that, certainly over A.T. Wall's tenure as the longest serving director in the country, there was a real shift to an understanding and a culture change, even among our staff, that while public safety is our number one mission, and it's always going to be our number one mission, that it's a dual mission, because we do recognize that everyone, with rare exception, is getting out and going back to their communities, and those are our communities too. And so we want to be able to do what we can do to give them the tools to succeed when we get out. So yes, public safety, but rehab is a huge portion of what we do every single day.
And I appreciate that because, as you mentioned, they're coming back to all of our communities, right? All of our neighborhoods, our neighbors, and deserve to be treated with dignity, even because we're not our worst mistakes, right?
Correct.
And they deserve the opportunity to be treated humanely and with dignity. My concern is that all of the things that you have stated is based on policies that the DOC has implemented. You've been in the tenure for 23 years. You'll probably be there hopefully for a while, right? Who comes next may decide that those policies are not correct. And it seems to me, based on everything that you're saying, that these reforms that you have done or that your department has done has caused positive effects, right? So then what is the hurdle? What is it that you need from the legislature in order to implement these or other reforms that will positively, impact the lives of those that are particularly those who have been put in restricted housing?
So what I'm concerned about is that if you read 425610 and you read that list of really comprehensive list of all the responsibilities that the corrections has to its staff, to the public, and to the offenders in its custody, as well as on probation and parole, that within that framework there is room to evolve. There is room to adapt to evolving correctional practices and best practices. When you try to carve something aside from that into law, you completely stymie and stunt the ability of the department to continue that evolution. I think that the powers of the director already cover what needs to be done. Now, if I win Powerball this week, and that would be cool.
I want help.
And I'm on a beach somewhere, and a new director comes in and throws all of this out the window, there's a remedy for that. Okay? I'm very afraid of the risk posed by carving into legislation, carving into law, aspects of prison management that really do tie the hands of the director and the prison responsible for the lives of the people in their custody, while still giving them the responsibility. So like, you're taking my tools away, but you're still making me in charge of making sure the house stands,
Yeah.
I really do believe that the current law on the books, the powers of the director, allow for the evolution that needs to happen without this legislation. I find portions of this legislation, frankly, extremely dangerous.
Through the chair, I have just two more questions. I understand that. Do you happen to know when that statute was implemented into law?
Yeah, it
By any
was.
chance? I don't have it in front of me.
So, right, so I do. Hold, please. 1976.
That's a very long time ago.
Well, it's been amended,
amended. It's been
a
amended.
number of times, and the last time it was amended was in 2019. And so, but it really does cover everything, and as I said, it does allow for the evolution necessary let me use maximum security as an example, okay? 2 years after the telephone was invented, okay? Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, and 2 years after that, maximum security opened. It's 140 years old. It was not designed for modern correctional practices. We do the very, very best we can. And you could literally eat off the floor. And you could eat off the floor not because I'm going to clean the floor. And you know what, though? I'll be respectful when others testify. And I don't think it's a lot for me to ask for the same.
Ladies and gentlemen, this doesn't work unless everyone respects everyone who's at the lectern, right? So when it's whoever's up there, we're going to be quiet and listen to them. And I ask you to do the same for this witness. Thank you.
Thank you. And it wouldn't be putting on a show for you. That's the way it is. But it's really old. And would I love to have a situation where we could have a facility that really allows us to do all of the things that we know we should and could be doing if we had the resources? Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then finally, through the chair, I just have one quick comment, not really a question, but thank you for your testimony. I really appreciate your insight and your positions. In terms of the discretion and tying the hands, the DOC is no different than any other body that we here as the legislature, particularly the judiciary, have passed legislation to reform, right? We talk about bail reform and we talk about other legislation that impacts the criminal justice system that the judges see as tying their hands, but in some instances it's important for us as this body to take those risks and do that. Why? Because we've seen that the system as it is right now does not work for everyone, right? And I think it's important for us to keep an open mind and try to figure out how do we work together to ensure that we pass legislation that's meaningful, because I disagree that only with policy we're gonna get there. The other thing is, like, I also know we've been, as advocates, trying to push to have a meeting with yourself and others from the DOC in terms of talking about this legislation. There has been no response. So
I respectfully, Rep, I disagree. I have had numerous email exchanges with you, as have members of my staff.
No, with me, yes.
I have invited every member of this committee in a hand-delivered invitation to come and tour the prison.
Correct, but I don't
I'm touring
want-
the prison next week with a number of members of the Senate. I'm
If I
always
may?
open and I'm easy to find.
if I may, I'm not saying with me. You probably will answer my emails, right? It's important.
I answer
right?
everyone's emails.
But I'm saying, for my conversations with community advocates, members of the coalition, are those folks who have been asking for meetings prior to me even taking this bill, who have not received a response. So my question to you on the record with the committee is, are you willing to meet with us, with myself and the committee and the members of the coalition, to talk and discuss this bill in particular to see where can we find common ground?
I'm always happy to meet with and talk with anyone.
Okay.
I do not see room for common ground on this bill. I'm not going to sugarcoat that.
Okay.
And the reason for that is the risk that you talk about involves people's actual lives. And other inmates are counting, and their families are counting on us to keep them safe. And so if I see something as my responsibility as director that I believe poses an unreasonable risk to the safety and lives of the people that I am charged with maintaining, then I do not find room for compromise on that. That said, I'm happy to sit with anyone and talk with them about reforms that we can effect, because I think there's always room for improvement in any system, whether it's DEM or the DOC. There's always room. We don't have all the answers. We don't know everything. I'm not going to, say that. But what I cannot commit to you is that I think that there's room for compromise in this legislation.
And you mean this legislation in particular, or any legislation that seeks to?
The bill that we're
Okay.
looking at tonight.
Okay, so I look forward to working with you and
Sure.
the members of the coalition in terms of finding out what are those common grounds. And in particular, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to continue to fight for this bill, just so you know.
I understand.
Because as we've seen in other jurisdictions, this is something that has worked, that I can see working here despite your concerns and what you're saying, because we've seen in other jurisdictions how it's actually improved safety and well-being for inmates. So I really thank you for your time and appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Rep.
Chair Vella Wilkinson, oh, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Director. Thank you
Good
for
evening.
being here tonight. I wanted to talk to you about a couple of things that were brought up at the Finance Committee meeting. It still pertains to this bill, Mr. Chairman, but there was some testimony that was given in Finance after you had left the meeting. I wasn't sure whether or not you had an opportunity to view that tape before coming here tonight.
I did, and we provided actually 2 responses to the testimony that was offered. We provided sort of an overview response to the chair of the subcommittee, and then he had follow-up questions, and we've submitted our very detailed answers to each of the follow-up questions that he had with regard to various aspects of that testimony.
Excellent. So I have some questions based on what I heard that night.
Okay.
I don't know if this is well, I'm just going to ask it. Could you please walk me through what progressive discipline looks like at the ACI where it ends at solitary?
Sure. So there are, just like laws, there are all different kinds of rules, different kinds of severity. Some are meant to simply keep the place ticking, keep the place running in an orderly way, making sure that we know that we have everyone we started out the day with. So things like you have to stand up for the count. We count the inmates numerous times a day. It's the most important thing we do. And so all movement stops in the facility while the inmates are counted. You have to stand. If you're in your cell and it's during the day, you have to stand for the count because we need to know that you're a living, breathing body. If you don't feel like standing for the count that day, and the officer tells you you need to stand for the count, and you disobey the officer, you could be subject to discipline. Now, you'll probably be subject to a warning, and that's usually sufficient. You could opt for something called a two-nighter, where you don't have a disciplinary hearing, you agree to take basically 2 nights without privileges. Okay, you're going to lose your privileges. Maybe you'll be fed in your cell rather than going to the dining room. There's kind of like a spectrum of punishments. And it's based on the severity of the offense. And so no one is going to long-term restrictive housing because they failed to stand for the count. The people that are serving, so that said, so our policy spells out very clearly, these offenses will get you up to 15 days. These offenses will get you up to 30 days, and so on. If an offense exposes the inmate to long-term segregation, long-term restrictive housing in disciplinary confinement, and I don't want to steal everything that Lynn Corey is going to talk about, but there is an opportunity. First of all, there's an appeal from the decision of the disciplinary board to the warden. And then there is an opportunity if the disciplinary confinement term is longer than 90 days. There are automatic reviews. First, there's a requested review that the inmate can ask for, and then after that, there's an automatic review, whether the inmate requests it or not. And if the behavior is such, after the initial offense, if the behavior is such that the inmate is behaving, frankly, and following the rules, that time can be suspended by the warden, and frequently is. And that's a new aspect, relatively new aspect of our policy. That wasn't in place 10 years ago, because as I said, we have learned, we evolve, we look to see what works. It's not helpful trying to manage a prison keeping people locked up all the time. It's not something we want to do. It's not a good thing. It's not good for them. It's not good for the officers. It's better to have people functioning in population, taking programs, working at jobs. And so we try to do the least restrictive that we can, but it has to be based on the offense. So the gentleman that I described earlier who stabbed the correctional officer in Maximum, he got a disciplinary term, I believe, of 364 or 365 days. But he was reviewed continually. And as I say, inmates who either already had mental illness or seem to be developing mental illness have frequent access to our mental health clinicians. And I know Ms. Bouchard is going to talk about that in detail. We have a large contingent of inmates who suffer from mental illness before they came to us, and some after they came to us. We are sort of referred to as the largest mental health facility in the state, and that's really unfortunate. And so we take that very, very seriously to heart. And so the provision of mental health services at the ACI has changed dramatically, even over my tenure there, from what it used to be. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that was a good answer, thank you. And I'm hoping that the bill, and I don't remember who the originator was, so I could give that individual a shout out for it, but there is a bill that is coming through the system up here at the General Assembly that talks about the mental health intervention court. So hopefully that will also have a direct positive impact on life at the ACI.
And we are very supportive of that legislation.
So let me ask you, and there's no delicate way of putting this, and
That's fine.
I'm not trying to disrespect you by saying this. Once an inmate, is it proper to call the individual the incarcerated inmate? I want to make sure I'm not offending anyone.
So there's a lot of different terms, and I'm a member of an organization comprised of all the directors, and sometimes they're commissioners or secretaries. They're called different things nationwide. And I recently kind of put out a survey to all of my peers to say, what do you call them? Because I've seen that term change over time, even since I've been there. It used to be acceptable to call them prisoners. We don't call them prisoners. Generally, we use the word offender because our policies are generally written, and they can have application, some of them, to both people incarcerated at the ACI and people in the community on home confinement or probation and parole. And so offender is sort of a catch-all. We do use inmate. Some other states use other terms. There doesn't seem to be a real universal term. There are terms that are more, I want to say, up and coming, that are not really prevalent nationwide, that I have heard others use. Formerly incarcerated person, person experiencing incarceration. We say inmate.
All right, thank you. So once the offender has committed some type of an action that lands him or her into solitary, are they left to serve their time, or are they being screwed with while they're in confinement?
I'm not sure I know what you mean with screwed
Well,
with.
I mean, some of the things that I heard, quite frankly, I found alarming. I mean, the fact that they're freezing their asses off, excuse me, I don't mean to be rude, but they're freezing their asses off in there, they're not being given a blanket, I'm assuming because of the fear of them hanging themselves or something of that nature, that they're in a completely bright room the entire time that they're there, so it's very difficult for them to sleep, that the only thing that they're really able to hear is the screams of another incarcerated person that might be, I don't know if it's down the hall or how it's situated,
Sure.
but you know, I could just imagine what it would be like if I was locked in such a small confining room, freezing, screaming people around me, light blaring in my face. I mean, how are they supposed to be able to get any type of decent frame of mind so that they could petition to go back to, you know, general population or wherever it was that they came from?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that. And I
Please.
think that's a fair question, given some of the testimony that I know was presented to House Finance the other night. First of all, I'm a broken record. Please come see it. Please come see. Because
I have been a
what
few
I think,
times.
oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
What you will see is a number of factors. First of all, what you will see is a staff that is governed by a code of ethics and conduct that is very strictly enforced. We have a code of ethics and conduct. It's written. I'd be happy to give you a copy of it. Every single person that works or volunteers or provides services in any way at the ACI is governed by the code of ethics and conduct. I have an internal affairs unit staffed by law enforcement experts, as well as former correctional officers who've worked their way up. In fact, my chief inspector is here this evening, who investigate any and all allegations of staff misconduct. So staff screwing with an inmate, first of all, doesn't go unnoticed, would very unlikely today to remain unreported, and would get thoroughly investigated and punished. I have fired quite a number of people since I've been director. It's not something I like to do. In fact, I think it's the worst part of my job, but I do it because it really interferes with the reputation and the professionalism of the rest of that department. And I think one of the things that I have heard people comment on who have come through, various officials and professionals of all kinds, that they, it's never what they think it's going to be. And one of the aspects of that is the staff. That the staff these are very professional men and women. They are sworn law enforcement. They go through a 12-week, very, very intensive training program. And they take an oath of office, which is enforced through that code of ethics and conduct. We struggle with our physical plant. As I said, maximum's 140 years old. Ventilation is an issue. When the heat breaks in one of our facilities, which if it's going to break in February, or the air conditioning breaks, and it does, and it breaks in July, we don't let people sit alone shivering in their cells. We make sure that they have what they need, whether it's extra clothing, whether it's extra blankets, what have you. We have a number of cells in maximum security right now that are unusable because they have plumbing issues or heating issues or physical issues where they're literally disintegrating. We don't put inmates in those cells. It's not in our interest to torment an inmate that way. Maybe back in the day, maybe back when the federal court had to step in, that was the way of life at the ACI, and I'm here to tell you it's not anymore.
Good. And then my very last question is, what is the maximum amount of time per day that someone is kept in solitary? Are they kept 22, 23 hours a day? Or?
It depends on the facility, and it depends on the mod, and that's a function of our staffing. It can be up to 22 hours. I would like it to be fewer. As I said, I really struggle with staff because it would be all well and good to just throw open the cells and say, okay, everybody can come out now, but that may not be safe for everyone. Mm-hmm. And I have to, number one always has to be, how do we do this safely? Everything has to be done safely.
Well, I do appreciate the fact that you have an emphasis on safety, not only for the corrections officers, but for the rest of the community there. So thank you, and thank you very much for your answers tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Corvese.
Quick question. Do you have surveillance throughout the facility?
Yes.
And,
You mean, by that you mean video surveillance? Yes.
And who monitors that?
So there is a security specialist that is assigned, there's one assigned to each of our facilities, and they are overseen by a chief of security. And so that is staff that monitors that footage, preserves when needed that footage. There are some cells in particular, for example, there are psychiatric cells and intake that each cell is individually surveilled via camera and is monitored live by the officers, depending on the inmate's status. So if the inmate, let's say if the inmate is at extreme risk of suicide, that is someone that is monitored continually by staff. So it sort of depends, but generally, yes, the entire complex.
Are the individuals who monitor the system on site?
Yes.
Do you have
They are state employees. They're members of the Rhode Island Brotherhood of Correctional Officers. And they've received specialized training in various security methods.
How long do you keep the video?
It depends. Some of the video is, after a while it gets written over as part of the system that runs it. If there's a need for it, if there's been an incident and we need that footage, it can be preserved.
All right. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Representative Baptista.
So I'll keep my comments brief. First, I want to make sure I'm close enough to this thing. And second, I want to thank you for being here and testifying tonight. I can appreciate that you have a difficult role. I say that as somebody who is a defense attorney and who spends my career trying to get people out of the prison system. And there's a number of things I'd love to talk to you about, and I'll take you up on your invitation and would love to have a longer conversation because I know it is 9:15 and there's quite a few bills left. One main thing that I want to talk about, or just ask you, first of all, you mentioned a scenario in your testimony where an inmate killed an officer at your prison, and obviously that is the most tragic thing that could happen. It should never happen, and I'm sorry for the loss of the department. You also used that example to say that 15 days in restrictive housing would not be a deterrent.
Right.
I'm not going to beat around the bush. My point is, and I wonder what you would say in response, I wonder, how do you calculate what would be a sufficient amount of days to be a deterrent? Because it's kind of hard to prove, right? If this person is there for 15 days, 20 days, then they would not have done that, right? First, let me ask, what is the longest amount of time that somebody can be in this type of housing? It was 22 hours per day, but how many days?
365.
That is the longest somebody can be in there.
Yes.
And I'm not a scientist. I'm an attorney at that. I personally really struggle with the idea that this sort of punishment is a deterrent, more of a deterrent than it is to already be in prison.
What I can tell, I'm sorry.
No, please.
What I can tell you is that, and I've heard this from my colleagues in other states. In fact, we asked some of the other states who have had similar legislation proposed what their reaction has been, what their experience has been. What I can tell you is some have seen an uptick in assaults. Some, inmates talk, and they talk to the staff because that's who they're with all day. And so some inmates in other systems have told officers, 15 days is totally worth it for what I want to do. If I want to kill a rival gang member, yeah, okay, fine, 15 days. Because you're dealing with, generally, and some of the people that would be excluded from disciplinary confinement under this legislation, the very youthful offenders who don't have a lot of impulse control, who don't have a lot of long vision toward consequences. 15 days is nothing compared to their goal, and we hear that, and other systems, my colleagues have told me, have heard that from the inmates, that, it's one thing to know that if I if I have my girlfriend when she visits me convey fentanyl into this facility, if I get caught, I'm going to lose visits for a long time. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to not be able to participate in programming. I'm going to lose good time. And good time is the gold standard. That's a deterrent. So, anything that kind of takes away those tools, now I got a free-for-all on my hands. And that's, it's not just dangerous for staff, it's dangerous for other inmates who really are relying on us to help keep them safe. The percentage of people in disciplinary confinement at the prison is very small, but it's like any society, most people obey the law, right? Most people follow the rules in any classroom, in any endeavor, any business, right? There's always a handful that are a problem, and that's what I deal with too. But I need that deterrent effect. Otherwise, there's no incentive to behave, and if people don't feel like we're keeping them safe, they feel like they need to do what they need to do to keep themselves safe, and that's when, mayhem ensues.
One quick follow-up. I'm particularly concerned about the intake center. The last I checked, the total, and this is a couple years ago, so please correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
Total prison population between men and women was somewhere north of 3,000 people.
Yeah, it's much lower now. You're asking specifically intake?
No, the total prison population.
Sure. The total prison population as of midnight, last night, was 2,120, and that's 53.1% of our capacity. Our population has dropped significantly.
So 2,100 is your total prison population, men, women, security?
Men,
everything.
women, everybody, awaiting trial and sentence.
Of the 2,100, how many are in intake, approximately?
Okay, hold on. I should have had this printed in bigger. It's pretty microscopic. 760, which is 66.2% of the capacity at intake.
But it's also about 1/3 of the total prison population.
Right.
And so do you have, and I'm not meaning to trick you, I'm just curious in general, do you have any sense of those people in intake, how frequently it is those people who end up in restrictive housing versus the rest of the population? Does that happen often? Is it rare?
I think I do have that. If you give me 1 second. What I can tell you, where am I? What am I looking at? I have this. Oh, please. That doesn't help me. So the inmate population on March 31st, that's SPMI. I'm looking at this, right? No, come here. Come here. So we did a snapshot of our population on March 31st, right? So just boom, that day. There were 767 inmates in the intake service center, okay? 0% on that day were in administrative confinement. 8 inmates, which is 1.04% of the population at intake, was in disciplinary confinement.
At that time?
On that day.
Yeah. Just the reason why I'm picking at intake is because that's my concern with the prison population in general. A lot of the folks who are there at intake are people who have not been convicted of crimes yet.
Right.
And so to think that it's bad enough that they're there, but that's, more laws that we'll think about for another.
Which we have nothing to do with.
I know, I get it. But my concern would be especially with those people, right? People who haven't even been convicted, now they're not only in prison, but also in the worst kind of it. So
Yeah.
that was my focus on, and when we have another conversation, I'd love to discuss more about that, but thank you very much.
And while I have you, Rep. Knight, you had asked about the bail under Chair Williams' bill on people held for want of bail. And there were 55 people that Rep. Felix referenced. 53 of those 55 were held on surety bail. One was held on double surety bail, and one was held on cash bail. Sure.
Thank you. And I think it's important for the audience to know, I have a strong suspicion the double surety bail person is a fugitive, and the law demands
Probably.
double fugitive,
Yeah.
double
'Cause
surety.
you don't see that.
But you don't see
hardly
that too
ever.
often. Only with fugitives, right? Where we're holding them for some other state to come and get them.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more questions of this witness? I just have, I concur with Rep. Bella Wilkins about the 22 hours seems to be, I don't know how you're going to get, depending on how many days they're in solitary confinement, 22 hours in a given day would probably border on being, not even border, I mean, it'd definitely drive you crazy.
So could I just interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
So I know, and I don't want to be overly involved in semantics, and I know that there's lots of different terms for lots of the things that we're talking about. But under the definition of solitary confinement is by definition includes the aspect of zero meaningful human contact.
Right.
And what Caitlin Bouchard is going to describe to you will show to you that that is not the case for people currently in restrictive housing. That's why you never hear me say solitary confinement.
Okay.
And
Thank you
so
for that.
while I agree that it's probably not pleasant, I can tell you that these facilities are clean. People are not shivering, freezing, sweating. On those days when the stuff is broken, we deal with it. We bring in fans, we give extra blankets, whatever.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's not. It's not like the
No,
movies.
I've been on the tour with Richard Ferrucci, and
Appreciate
many
it.
of us have.